On October 16, 1946, a man who helped shape the deadliest war in human history climbed 13 steps in a prison gymnasium in Nuremberg and walked toward a noose. He didn't beg. He didn't panic. He stood straight, looked ahead, and spoke his final words to Germany. But what happened next was far from the quick death many expected. This was the final night of Alfred Jodl, one of Hitler's closest military strategists, a man who believed until his very last breath that he had done nothing wrong, and his final minutes would become one of the most haunting moments of the Nuremberg Trials. Alfred Jodl wasn't a street-level soldier. He wasn't a guard at a camp or a low-ranking officer following orders. He was one of the most powerful military minds in the entire Third Reich, the man who sat beside Hitler every single day of the war, translating the Führer's madness into operational reality. Almost every major military decision that flowed out of the Nazi war machine passed through Jodl's hands. Every advance into Poland, every blitzkrieg order, every directive authorizing the murder of civilians and prisoners of war, his signature was either on it or behind it. And yet, standing in the dock at Nuremberg, he looked at the judges and said, "I was a soldier doing my duty." The judges didn't buy it. And today, we're going to walk through the entire arc of his life, his crimes, his trial, and the final moments of a man who commanded armies but couldn't escape justice. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications for more real stories from history. And if you've been here for a while, welcome back. Let's get into it. Alfred Joseph Ferdinand Jodl was born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, Bavaria, into a military family where discipline wasn't a choice. It was the atmosphere you breathed from birth. He was sharp, methodical, the kind of student who didn't just memorize tactics, he understood why they worked. By the time World War I broke out, Jodl was already an artillery officer, earning decorations and building a reputation for cold, precise thinking under pressure. But here's the thing about World War I that shaped Jodl more than anything else: Germany lost. And for a man who had given everything to the German military, that defeat didn't just sting, it became an obsession. He spent the 1920s watching Germany humiliate itself under the weight of Versailles. And when a loud, charismatic man named Adolf Hitler started promising to reverse all of it, Jodl, like thousands of German officers, paid attention. By the mid-1930s, Jodl had climbed high enough in the German military structure to be noticed. But it was 1939, the eve of the most destructive war in human history, that changed everything. He was appointed Chief of the Operations Staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW. In plain terms, he became Hitler's top operational planner. Every morning, Jodl would sit in military briefings with Hitler. He would spread maps across the table, walk the Führer through troop positions, and translate geopolitical ambition into military movement. For 6 years straight, he was the man standing closest to the engine of Nazi military power. And here's the detail that will stay with you. Jodl admired Hitler, not blindly, not without moments of private frustration, but genuinely. He believed in the mission. He believed Germany was fighting for survival. That belief is exactly what made him so dangerous. Now let's talk about what Jodl actually did, because this is where his story stops being about military ambition and starts being about crimes against humanity. In October 1941, Jodl issued what became known as the Guidelines for the Conduct of Troops in Russia. The directive was chilling in its clarity. Soviet civilians who resisted German forces were to be executed. No trial, no process, just death. But it didn't stop there. In 1941, Jodl signed or approved the Commissar Order, an order commanding German forces to execute Soviet political officers immediately upon capture. These were prisoners of war, protected under international law. Jodl had them killed anyway. Then there was Norway and the Balkans. In occupied territories, Jodl authorized the execution of hostages. innocent civilians taken and shot in retaliation for partisan resistance. Hundreds of people, including women and elderly men, were executed under orders that flowed directly from his desk. He wasn't pulling triggers, but the fingers on those triggers were following his instructions. By 1943, the war was no longer the triumphant march it had been. Stalingrad had happened, the myth of German invincibility was cracking, and the briefings in Hitler's headquarters were becoming darker, more desperate, more unhinged. Jodel, to his credit, occasionally pushed back. In September 1942, he had a famous confrontation with Hitler over strategy in the Caucasus, and for weeks afterward, Hitler refused to shake his hand or eat at the same table. That gives you a window into what it was actually like inside that inner circle. These men were terrified of Hitler, even the generals. But here's what makes Jodel different from others who pushed back. He never quit. He never defected. He never worked against the regime. He stayed, he planned, and he kept signing. By May 7th, 1945, the war was over. Jodel was the man who signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France, on behalf of a regime that had destroyed an entire continent. He signed it in his uniform, calmly, with the same composure he'd brought to every order he'd ever issued. Within days of the surrender, Allied forces had Jodel in custody. He was flown to Nuremberg, where the world was preparing to do something it had never done before: put war criminals on trial in a court of law, with evidence, testimony, and due process. Jodel didn't seem particularly worried at first. He genuinely believed that what he had done was legal, that a soldier following orders from a head of state was protected. He prepared his defense carefully and chose to testify in his own behalf. That decision would prove costly. The Nuremberg Trials opened in November 1945, and Alfred Jodl stood among 21 of the most powerful surviving figures of the Third Reich. When it was his turn to speak, Jodl was articulate, composed, and utterly unapologetic in tone. He argued that he was a professional soldier, bound by oath, operating within a legitimate chain of command. He claimed ignorance of the Holocaust's full scale. He insisted his orders were militarily justified. The prosecution had a different view, and they had documents, hundreds of signed orders, directives with his name, testimony from survivors and subordinates. The paper trail against Jodl was overwhelming, and every time his defense tried to frame him as a soldier simply doing his job, the prosecution pulled out another document that showed exactly what that job had involved. There was a particularly devastating moment when prosecutors displayed the Commando Order, a directive authorizing the execution of Allied Special Forces operatives even after capture. Jodl had disseminated it. Allied soldiers had died because of it. The courtroom was quiet in a way that courtrooms get when the truth is too heavy for noise. On October 1st, 1946, the judges delivered their verdict. Alfred Jodl, guilty on all 4 counts: war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war. The sentence, death by hanging. Jodl received the news with the same composed, unreadable expression he had maintained throughout the trial. He wrote a brief letter to his wife Louise, the woman he had married just the year before in the final days of the war, telling her he was at peace and that history would vindicate him. He was wrong about the second part, but perhaps not about the first. The night before his execution, Jodl ate a simple meal and slept, or at least appeared to. Prison guards who checked on him reported he was calm. No pacing, no breakdowns, no last-minute confessions. He spent time writing, not a plea for mercy. There was none coming, and he knew it. He wrote reflections. He remained to the end, convinced that he had served Germany with honor, and that the verdict against him was political rather than legal. There's something uniquely unsettling about that. A man who helped engineer mass murder, sitting in his cell the night before his death, feeling at peace. It speaks to the terrifying capacity of ideology to insulate a person from the full moral weight of what they've done. At 1:11 a.m. on October 16, 1946, Alfred Jodl was led into the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. The room had been hastily converted for the occasion. 3 gallows stood against the far wall, draped in black. American military guards lined the room. Journalists and official witnesses stood in silence. Jodl climbed the 13 steps with a straight back. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke quietly in German. "I salute you, my Germany." The trap opened at 1:11 a.m. His death was not clean. Like several of the other men executed that night, the drop was miscalculated. Jodl did not die instantly. It took several minutes before he was gone. There are those who see a grim irony in that. A man who had authorized so many summary executions, so many deaths without process or mercy, experiencing his own death with the same brutality his orders had delivered to others. History doesn't always deliver neat symmetry, but sometimes it comes close. In 1953, a West German denazification court posthumously reversed Jodl's conviction, declaring that he had in fact been a soldier and not a criminal. The decision caused international outrage. Allied nations condemned it. Historians pushed back. And over the following decades, as more documents surfaced and more scholarship emerged, the reversal was widely regarded as a political concession to a German public still struggling to process what their country had done. Modern consensus is firm. Alfred Jodl was not simply a soldier, he was an architect of atrocity, a man with the education, the authority, and the intelligence to know exactly what the orders he signed would produce and who signed them anyway. He never gave an order to build a death camp. But the war of extermination that made those camps possible was planned in large part in the same room where Jodl unrolled his maps every morning. Alfred Jodl spent his entire career believing that professionalism and loyalty could coexist with complicity, that a man could serve an evil regime and remain personally clean if he framed everything as duty. Nuremberg said otherwise, and that is perhaps the most important thing his story leaves us with, not the drama of the execution, not the scale of his crimes, but the quiet, ordinary-seeming way a highly intelligent man convinced himself that none of it was really his fault. Evil rarely looks like a monster. More often, it looks like a general in a clean uniform, calmly spreading maps across a table. That's what makes Alfred Jodl and the world that made him worth remembering.